In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the 10th edition of Emerging Stories. I'm your host, Kadir van Lohuizen, and welcome to the show again. You can join us either via Zoom or you can log in at pakhuisdezwijger.nl and you can chat with our guests or you can ask questions as well. So I'm very happy to have three new guests. We will focus very much on the future of journalism, private issues around digitalization, the whole COVID-19 issue, and the apps that start to appear. In the studio, I have Tamara Witsche. She is a professor in media and cultural identity in the Netherlands. And via Zoom, very happy to have Nighat Dad, who is a Pakistani lawyer and internet activist. And quite late for him already, Pramesh Chandran, who is a journalist and CEO and co-founder of Malay Kisini. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you.
You just published a book, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, Beyond Journalism. I have it here together with Mark Doze, a dear friend and colleague of mine.
Can you, what is it about? Can you tell us a little bit about it?
So it's called Beyond Journalism because we saw so much moving in the field of journalism that we asked, okay, are all these new startups that are happening under the banner somehow of journalism, is that still journalism? Can we still call it journalism? Is it what we thought journalism was, or do we need a new name? Do we need to reconsider the whole concept of what journalism is and what journalism is for? So we researched startups in the whole world. And I say we, but it's together with graduate students of ours. And so they went to very, very many places and they studied the startups, and we did too. We also studied in the Netherlands, and we asked, what are they doing? How are they funded? But primarily also, how do they feel about doing the work that they do? So we really wanted to tap into their aspirations, their motivations, but also their frustrations. Why did they start a startup? Why not in traditional media? Why do they strike out on their own?
So, I mean, it's almost sounds like if you did this research during the COVID-19 crisis. I guess you didn't because you traveled.
Oh, no, we didn't. I mean,
but it sounds very relevant.
It is very relevant, and at the same time, it's very hard to make any extrapolations from this to now. So we published it. It came out in this February in 2020.
Just before.
So yes, just before. And of course, the research then ended last year. We wouldn't have been able to do it in the same way that we did it because, one, we wouldn't be able to travel to all those places, nor could our students, but also there are no newsrooms where physically all the journalists are working together, so everyone is even more disparate, so even more spread out. Indeed, here you see a picture of one of the newsrooms that we researched, and one of the startups that or collectives actually, that we researched. And that's where our students could go and ask questions. But even in the time that we researched, of course, there were people working from cafes, people working from home, everywhere. But
could you give what do you mean by startups in journalism? Could you give us an example?
Yes, I can give you examples, but at the same time, it's really hard to define it. So we didn't define it. So examples are Zetland in Denmark, which is a very creative new startup, which also produces what we would not call maybe journalism. They make theater shows, and of course that's more common now. But they were very new and innovative in that area. We look at Inca Binca, which is more looking at algorithms in news, automated news. We look at university outlets who are trying to do this journalism work. So really, and in the Netherlands, for instance, The Correspondent, and it's a more well-known example that is now also international. So there were a range of startups, but also collectives. So we didn't define it per se, because what we wanted to do is really let the field speak. So in university research, normally, very often, we start with a definition. And the definition is already very exclusive. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to ask people who are somehow either calling themselves journalists or seen as contributing to journalism as by others. So by no form or means they need to be in this traditional form. They could be really innovative.
But do you see many of these startups which you research, do you see them as possible replacing traditional media as we know it?
The funding model suggests no, because almost none of the startups actually made enough money to survive. So, and indeed, a couple of them already in the few years that we ran the project collapsed. And we come to talk about that, but
apart from thinking about content and how to communicate, I guess they also think about a business model.
So indeed, so in terms of the business model, often it's short-lived projects, and they get funding, they get seed funding, or there are a couple of really sort of key people who invest either their own network and their own money, and then keep it running. And that's standard for startups anywhere. So startups don't normally, I mean, it's the question, do they live past the 2 years? So in that sense, you say they don't replace, but if you look at their innovative power and the impact that they have on the field as a whole, then they are certainly not replacing traditional journalism, but they are impacting and influencing the way in which traditional journalism is being practiced.
And then COVID-19 came.
Yes.
I guess you're still in touch with some of the...
We haven't. It's very hard in general now because everyone is like up to here. So we haven't gone back to see how they're doing at this moment. But in general, we know that in the newsrooms, it's quite dire. I mean, the COVID-19 crisis impacts a lot of people, of course, and also you see that smaller news organizations. I mean, this is in the UK, where they called for a fund for the smaller news parties, because the bigger newsrooms, news organizations,
you mean
media organizations,
local newspapers,
but also indeed these startups, anything that is not a bigger collective or a bigger organization that can fund through this, right? I mean, hopefully it's temporary. We don't know when this is over. But you have to have quite a buffer. And the startups that we looked at, they don't have that mostly.
Because it's, we've been talking in this program quite a few times about, especially last week, about programs from the European Central Bank and from different governments who are supporting sometimes really big multinationals. Do you know any example of where a government is actually supporting independent media in these times of Corona?
The example that you just saw, that's calling for it, right?
In the UK.
In the UK, and I don't know how far their lobby is going. So I don't know of any example. I hope there are, but I don't know of any example that does that. What you do see more generally,
it's not very good that you haven't heard of.
No, but what you do see more generally in the creative sector, the cultural sector, is crowdfunding, asking for people to donate, and you see it, for instance, also like the Conversation is an example that is an Australian-based news collective which is working together with scientists to report on contemporary issues, and their reporting has skyrocketed, the interest in their reporting has skyrocketed, and they are asking, okay, please donate, because particularly now we need it. So you do see that type of more direct investment, or at least calls for investment.
But it poses the question of course, if journalism is a luxury or a necessity.
Absolutely, and it's something that we keep coming back to also with our work. Is journalism a public good that needs to be paid for publicly? And of course, and maybe our guests from today can also speak to that. In every media market is different, right? Mm-hmm. And in the Netherlands, there are ways in which journalism is funded and subsidized or supported, but it's still it's not labeled as a public good necessarily in large amount of money.
Because a lot of local newspapers seems to be collapsing at the moment, like in the US, but also elsewhere in the world, because maybe journalism is still considered to be a necessity, but if the advertisers walk out, many of them can't pay the bill anymore.
Indeed, and this was going on for much longer already, so this is a trend that seems to have actually just sped up. So it was already going on, and now you see that the dire state in which many of these newsrooms are is actually indeed warranting to act quicker.
So what's the future? Simple question, right?
It's a very simple question. I have the answer to it. I wouldn't be sitting here maybe. I seriously don't know. I don't know how long this will last. I think in general, this crisis had...
But in general, the future of journalism, even without COVID-19 happening?
Well, I'm very hopeful. Because I'm very hopeful because I see so many passionate people working in this industry, and also lots of people around it that are actually interested. So public organizations in the Netherlands who are this article is 20 million times read. And this is from The Conversation. So
theconversation.com.
Yeah, so it was actually published by a Spanish Spanish academic together with a journalist. So they always work together. And then it was translated. So it came on the Spanish Conversation, and then it was translated, and it got read over 20 million times.
Which is an online platform, the conversation.
It is an online,
right?
Yes, and it's to get academic knowledge into the public domain more broadly and very accessible. So it's
a collaboration between journalists and scientists.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and it's really so. One of the problems in journalism is, of course, how do you pay for all the research that needs to be done? And so how do you get the quality of the research up? And here, working together with academics, it actually is a win-win situation, because academic work is not very often read. So then this article, indeed 20 million times, and you see there is a need for it. And then whether that also translates into longer term either funding or awareness with the public, actually we need this. We need to have this type of quality information that steers us and that gives direction, helps us navigate through the information.
Because we have a question actually, which is kind of connected to this, so or maybe not. The question is, do you think there's enough innovation in journalism?
So
people often talk about traditional journalism, whatever that means. It means that
indeed,
you have a pen or a camera.
Indeed.
Or
what is innovation? So I won't ask what is innovation, but we do need to ask, where do we look? So if we look at the small startups, then we see, and some of them don't even call themselves journalists, but by people in journalism, they are deemed as the future or as an innovative way of doing journalism. And then you see really radical changes to the way in which we perceive journalism. I'm thinking of ACE in the Netherlands. ACE is designers are a collective together with journalists, and Verspers for also new forms of journalism. From their collaboration came up the Reunion Boys, which is like in response to Brexit. they thought, okay, more writing about it is not going to change it. We need to find a new way. So there was a boy band addressing these issues. Well, do you call it journalism? Where's the line? And if it has more impact on the social debate, maybe that's a way. And not all forums need to become like that. But what you see is that on smaller scales, there's definitely innovation. Also in the traditional newsrooms, some are very open and geared towards innovating, and they collaborate with all these small startups. So,
because people, I mean, it's obviously also a matter of do people pay for it, right? So before we had, often people had a subscription. They had a physical newspaper or a magazine. Now there's often paywalls, which people tend to complain about. How do you see this? Is this innovative, or is just is this a trap?
It's so tricky. So news has always been subsidized, either by advertisements or by public subsidies, or just because it was a public broadcaster. So the audience has never really paid the full amount of the costs, basically, that it costs to produce news. So, and that's been for a long time. So that's not new. Then
and people are aware of that?
I don't think it's generally you would look at that. I don't think people really think about that. Previously, they also, even when you had your newspaper, the newspaper gets either subsidies or they get a lower tax in the Netherlands. Then they get a lower tax rate. So there are ways in which that is subsidized, and then of course, indeed, through the advertisements. I don't think people are necessarily aware of it. You do see that the highly innovative forms, they do reach out to publics who then also pay. One of the examples in our book is Mediapart in France. It's one of the most successful startups that actually does create enough revenue. And they are building the type of relationship with their public that the public does pay for what they read, and they feel connected and they feel concerned. And so there you do have that new models. Whether that will happen in every country on the long run, that's very questionable.
Maybe we can bring in Nighat and Pramesh, our two other guests from Malaysia and Pakistan. How do you listen to what Tamara is talking about? You're from other parts of the world, so you might have a different view on this, or are you seeing some similarities?
Let me chip in. I think that there's definitely the age where media is totally advertising dependent. I think that's not going to return. I think advertisers today have so many ways to reach the consumer without going through the media. Besides Google and Facebook, in many markets you have billboards, and you have events, and many other ways. So a smaller percentage of advertising revenue will be going towards media companies. And I think we also need to separate between media and journalism. A lot of media is entertainment. So a lot of advertisers prefer a much more entertainment-based media product. They are safer, they are brand safe, they're not so controversial. So in fact, there's an inverse relationship between advertising and serious journalism. The more serious journalism you do, the more controversial, in-depth, investigative, the more you try to hold power to account. The reality is that the less advertising you get. It's not a correlation between the size of your audience and advertising. It's really about whether advertisers are comfortable in putting their ads in your media. Most big advertisers also have links to governments. In most of the world, the government actually in many ways dictate the media, and advertising will then fall in line. So I think by and large that is the case. I think there's a good case to be made for either some sort of public service funded journalism, other forms of journalism, funding journalism. For Malaysia Kini, we started charging a subscription fee back in 2002 because we asked ourselves, who really cares about our journalism? Who really cares about serious investigative and holding power and account? And we figured that's not the advertiser, that's actually our readers. And that's why we aligned our business model very much with our readership instead of with advertising for many years. And we continue to
Can we go
develop
to Nighat? Can we get your insight on this? From
I guess adding to what Ramesh said, in Pakistan, like the trend that we are seeing is that if we call it like serious mainstream journalism, I think more advertisers are shying away from it. And that's why we are saying, like the innovative journalism where, the startups or the young journalists where, like even the definition of the journalist is also kind of, like the press clubs or the people who are in the mainstream journalism, they are still not agreeing in terms of, who call themselves a journalist in this new media age. So I think the trend that we are seeing is that now that the more advertisers are shying away from the mainstream media or the mainstream journalism, people are moving towards the digitalization. That's where, the role of tech giants come in. That's where, they can produce news. I mean, there is another question around the quality of the news that we're seeing on the internet or on digital media platforms. But I think it also it depends a lot on how much resources one needs to produce that kind of news, which has access to to a public which has access to internet. So I think this is the kind of trend we are seeing. But I think I'm really concerned about the mushroom growth of, digital media journalists, or I don't know how you call them or term them, but I mean, it's good that people are getting more and more chance in digital media. But I think there is a compromise that we are making, and that's basically around what our first speaker was basically talking about, the quality of information that we are getting. And I mean, I'm sure that we'll be talking more about the misinformation and disinformation, but I mean, we are seeing the same trend in Pakistan as well, where even the mainstream media is picking up the news from the digital media platforms and they don't have sufficient skills in terms of verifying the information that they are picking from the internet, or verifying them or fact checking them. So I think they're like, it feels like there is a whole lot of confusion that is going on, to be very honest, and not much resources or funding is basically going into the media, especially if we talk about the public funds. We don't see it here, especially in this part of the region.
Because Nighat, you're a lawyer and you call yourself an internet activist as well. But you founded the Digital Rights Foundation back in 2012 already. Can you tell a little bit about what the aim is and what the foundation does?
Yeah, so I was practicing as a lawyer, but I started Digital Rights Foundation because as a lawyer, I was witnessing a lot of changes already happening back in 2009 and 2010, and role of online internet and digital media, but also like the legal regime around internet governance. And that sort of like pushed me as a lawyer to look more into this space. But I think one thing that pushed me more was how women in Pakistan started exploring this space and what kind of challenges they were facing while accessing mobile phones or accessing internet. Back then, Facebook or other social media platforms or Instagram, I mean, they were actually not there and not really famous. I remember there was this social media platform, Orkut was there, and it was already harder for women to reclaim technology, because tech was introduced, like in Pakistan, due to the patriarchal norms and the culture. The tech was already connected to the masculinity, and it was
Which
harder.
means, can you explain?
Yeah, it means that a man in your house had a privilege to access a mobile phone, but like a woman, it was she had to ask for this and had to fight for this, to even access a mobile phone. And even though even if she had an access to a mobile phone, there was this control and surveillance over her activities, how she's using, who she's talking to. So, I mean, this whole environment of technology and how it was impacting women it was very uncomfortable for me. And I wanted to explore this more, that how, if Constitution of Pakistan says that all individuals are equal and all have equal rights in terms of accessing information, in terms of accessing, exercising their free speech, then why, these social norms are so dominating, the behavior of humans. So that's where, I started looking into this. One thing we found, that the behavior online against women was really, really difficult, in terms of harassing them, or in discouraging them that this space doesn't belong to them. And I think that's where it became my mission, that this online space equally belongs to us as the offline space belongs to us. And my mission was that all the women in Pakistan have equal access to information and communication technologies, and that access should be safer and open, and no one is being able to control them, be it their families or their colleagues or friends or even the government. So
How is it today?
that's
How is it today, Nighat?
I think the culture around using technology by women is actually really changed. So now we see that lots of women have access to technology, but I still see that there is a divide. The women in the urban areas, I mean, it's more easy for them to access mobile phones and internet and laptops and computers. But still, I know I'm also from a village, and when I go back to my village, I know, if women have access to mobile phones, they still hide it from their family members, especially male family members. So there is this, divide between urban and rural, and 70% of our population live in the rural areas. So I see, yes, there is a change after 10 years, but I still see that a lot more work needs to be done around this.
And obviously, COVID-19 also hit Pakistan. Maybe later you can tell a little, can give us an update what the situation is. But how did COVID-19 had any impact on digital access or freedom that people have? Has it had a positive effect or?
So I think COVID-19, of course, under the lockdown, there was a positive and negative both. We have been advocating for equal access to internet. So internet accessibility is an issue. So when the government started online classes, lots of students, male and female, who were studying in the cities, they went back to their towns and villages. And when the online classes kept, the government continued them, it was very hard for them to take those classes, because in those villages and towns there was no access to internet, and it was shut, or either it was shut down. So there was this protest and the kind of movement that I'm seeing that it's emerging, where the young people are asking for more access and equal access to internet. But I think the downside of it, we saw at our cyber harassment helpline that due to the lockdown, the cases of cyber harassment increased by 189% as compared to the reports in the January and February. And in March and April, those cases were increased by 189% at our helpline. So the downside, we saw that the more people were under the lockdown and who had access to the technology, they had more time to harass women online as well. But one trend we saw very interesting, that women started reaching out to us through emails around the complaints of the domestic violence or the cyber harassment that they were facing. And it sort of, it's telling that it was difficult for them to reach out to us through a telephone, but writing an email for more easier and safer for them because of the people around them.
Nighat, did they reach out to you as a lawyer or as the Digital Rights Foundation?
So we have a cyber harassment helpline that we started in 2016, and the helpline basically takes complaints of women internet users in Pakistan, and also men too, and journalists and activists when they face harassment online or they face hate speech or trolling. So they reach out to us, and we sort of help them in accessing the law enforcement and the legal remedy, but also provide them digital security support and also mental health counseling.
Because I understood you also have a role in Facebook. Could you tell us a little bit what that is?
So I have just been appointed as a board member of Facebook Independent Oversight Board, which is still in the process of operationalizing itself. It will take a couple of months, but the board will basically look into the cases around content moderation from Facebook and Instagram throughout the world.
Okay, so that sounds like a full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a Supreme Court of Facebook.
Okay. Well, there's a lot to be done there, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you just briefly take us into what the situation is on COVID-19 in Pakistan? I mean, we've seen much more here from India, that India has been on extended lockdown. There's been lots of issues with millions of immigrants who were trying to get home. How is the situation? How was the situation in Pakistan? Briefly.
So the lockdown was... It started in the middle of the March, and it was pretty strict that time. And when the country started facing economic crisis, that's where the lockdown, the government started easing it out. There was this tension between the center and the provinces. Provinces are quite independent in taking decisions. So I think one thing that we have been discussing around media cycle around COVID was the confused messaging coming from the top was a massive issue, because it was not only confused, it was also when the media started reporting those confused messaging coming from the top leadership, it sort of started looking that as if it's a fake news, or if it's misinformation. And I think that's where we as an organization, and we also have a network of women journalists. We have more than 100 women journalists in that network. So we started discussing that how we can term this kind of information where your top leadership or your the head of the state is saying that it's not a lethal virus, but it's a flu. And when the media will start reporting it, how you will term this? You will term this as a fake news or misinformation or disinformation. So I think we are going through this sort of situation at the moment, where the confused messaging sort of gave a very wrong message to the masses around the virus. And I mean, people are up and about, but at the same time, we have crossed 100,000 COVID positive cases 2 days ago. It's increasing rapidly every single day. It's becoming scary, to be very honest. But at the same time, I would say that with the Dutch based organization Free Press Unlimited, we managed to support several journalists who were out in the field, and they were covering different issues around not only COVID, but also we had an unfortunate incident where the plane was crashed, and it was really, really sad, and we lost hundreds of people in that crash just 2 weeks back. So I feel that the journalists have been trying their best to perform their duties, but they didn't really have much support from their media houses, especially when it comes to women journalists. First of all, getting a permission from the families during COVID, going out and doing reporting, but with insufficient PPEs. They didn't have like proper the mask and everything that they need. So I think that these were the challenges that we were facing, but at the same time, I think with the support of some of the organizations like Free Press Unlimited, we managed to do something. But I mean, definitely need more. Now the journalists are getting sick. Like we are like hearing news every day. The whole newsroom is becoming, like COVID tested COVID positive. And that's pretty scary, because I think the precautions that the media houses and the government was supposed to take, they didn't do it in the initial stage. And now we are in really tragic situations.
I want to bring in our two other guests, but I have one question, because you were both a lawyer and the founder of the Digital Rights Foundation. I mean, there's lots of discussion about if the COVID-19 crisis is used to stretch the privacy laws in different countries. There's these Corona apps, which seem in some cases are not really privacy, there's a big issue with privacy. How do you look at this from a Pakistani, but also from a global point of view? And Tamara and Pramesh, if you add to this, if you have anything to add, please.
I think we, as an organization and also privacy advocates, saw a tremendous increase of, introducing these COVID apps. I mean, it started definitely from the developed countries and Western world, and then the developing countries started catching up and started introducing same apps. I think the only difference is that when you talk about Europe or UK or other countries, you also have protections in the form of Data Protection Act or laws or GDPR. But in our countries, I mean, we don't. I think in Malaysia there is also, I think, data protection law. But in Pakistan, we don't have such protection. So when the government start introducing such measures where the massive amount of data is being collected without any transparency and accountability, I think that's a major issue. I'm very concerned that not just in Pakistan, around the world, the kind of measures that the governments are taking in the name of COVID and, in containing the virus, and they are introducing this surveillance technologies, but also, violating the privacy. This will set a very bad precedent for a very longer time. I think it will set a precedent like the US did after 9/11, and the emergency laws that were introduced just to address that particular situation, they are still there. So my fear is that all the practices that the states are introducing, they will become like long-term practices of the governments in terms of violating citizens' privacy.
Is that the case in Malaysia as well, Pramesh?
Yeah, definitely. There's also been the introduction of different types of apps and track people. In Malaysia, none of it has been made compulsory.
Can you adjust your microphone a bit? Because
can you hear me now?
yeah.
Yeah. So in Malaysia, it's not been compulsory, but there's a lot of adoption. So it is true. It is it's kind of normalization of certain types of behavior of tracking people. People are getting used to this sort of intrusions onto their lives, having to record themselves wherever they go, take the temperature, put a phone number in, and because you've been under lockdown for so long, and it's a big relief to go out and and just to mingle with people. So people are kind of accepting this new norm that in fact you have to adopt and have this kind of behavior. We've also had a change of government in the last few months, just before the COVID crisis hit. So this has also been used as a means to legitimize the new government. The new government has not needed to meet the press. There are very few press conferences, so the journalists not access this new government. And they've also used the COVID-19 to actually give out a lot of aid, which is always welcome, but in a way it's also been used as a populist measure to justify this new government. So both politics as well as the conditions of the pandemic have come together and creating a new normal.
Because Pramesh, you're a journalist, but you're also a CEO and the co-founder of Malaysia Kini, which I think is a digital independent news platform. I think you are a real digital pioneer, right? Can you tell a little bit what the platform does and why you created it and when?
Malaysia Kini, which means Malaysia Now, was started 20 years ago in 1999. It's a long time. And at that stage, most of the media was in a way allied to the government or controlled by the government or people linked to the government. However, Malaysia introduced a new law that said that internet would not be censored. So we took the opportunity to launch Malaysia Kini as the only online media. So we have never had a print newspaper or a magazine purely online. And today we reach out to about 8 million Malaysians. We publish 4 languages: English, Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. And we are the #1 news source in the country. We have higher viewership for our news, even compared to the newspapers or the television. People are very much online in Malaysia. So we're a very dominant force in political news in the country. And we survive financially through very much a subscription model where we charge our readers a fee to read most of our content.
Hey, what's the situation of the freedom of the press in Malaysia? Because I think with the previous government or prime minister, there was a few issues. What can you bring us up to speed?
Well, for a very long time, we've had a very strong control of traditional media, meaning broadcast, television, newspaper, print, etc. The internet has come away and become much more independent over the years. And it's through this independent online media that we had a change in government in 2018. First time since our independence over 61 years, we've never had a change of government at the federal level. But due to the internet and opening up space, we had the first change of government in 2018. However, the new government only lasted 2 years, and the old government managed to come back to power, breaking apart the coalition which was running the new government. So in the recent weeks, the last 10 weeks, as the new government is in power, we've seen many more, much more limiting of press freedom space, more social activists and others being called up and asking questions about comments made online, particularly on Malaysia Kini. So we see members of parliament and civil society activists now being called up by the police for comments they have made, against corruption, etc., on Malaysia Kini.
Hey, Pramesh, I think the situation, how the government in Malaysia dealt with COVID-19 was perceived as quite positive. What's the situation now? There's not a second wave, right? Or is there?
No, I think the government did actually a good job. We shut down our borders very early, and we imposed pretty much a complete lockdown of the country in the mid of March. So we've had stringent enforcement. And only now, about 3 months later, we are opening up, and we have very low. We kept our number of cases under 10,000, and number of deaths slightly over 100. So a very low number of cases. Both because of the lockdown, but also, I mean, there's always talk about inoculations, what they call the PCG injections. One of the countries where we've had very high vaccination against things like tuberculosis and other types of health respiratory diseases, which many now have also said that helps to bring down the cases of COVID-19. So definitely the government has done a good job, and we have not had a second wave yet. But it remains to be seen what's going to happen over the next few weeks as we open up.
Because you recently moderated an online conference about telehealth.
Yes.
What was the role? Was this very specific because of the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, Malaysia Kini has always done different types of events, but now we're doing more of these events online, because of the COVID-19. And in terms of health, there have been, a lot of dramatic changes. So a lot more people are very much conscious about their health these days, right? Suddenly health is in the spotlight. So we talked about how health is changing or transforming in the era of COVID-19. So we had a case of, medical personnel, people running apps and hospitals about now how they're much more doing telehealth, providing medical services online, diagnostics to customers, to patients, but also what they call B2B, that means from one doctor to another doctor, so that GPs or doctors in certain rural areas can consult with experts in cancer and other areas using telehealth mechanisms. So in the era of COVID-19, there's a growth of all forms of digital types of services, whether it's in education, whether it's in health, or in any other areas. So we actually, it was one focus we've had on health.
Hey, it seems that your news platform is the only or one of the few profitable news outlets in Malaysia. How do you manage to do this? I mean,
yeah,
what's the trick? Tell us.
Well, yeah, actually, I mean, we're known to be one of the few profitable outlets. Even in most parts of the world, media these days are not profitable. So it's partly because we've started very early and we've kept our costs very low. We have about 120 people, which is pretty large for an online-only media, but it's still small compared to some other media. So we've managed our costs very effectively. We develop our own technology. We've got very good sales teams. So we're always ahead of the curve in terms of technology and adaptation. But definitely we aligned ourselves with our readers. So instead of relying on advertising, we aligned ourselves very much with subscription and our readers. And there's also a link to the whole political reform that happened in Malaysia over the last 20 years. So many people supported Malaysia Kini because it was, in a way, the voice of the movement for change. And they realized that unless they have an independent media in the country, they would not be able to break out of this kind of authoritarian rule and introduce a democratic government.
So your funding is actually your readership. It's not advertisers, as we were talking earlier.
Well, in the early years, especially when we were small, a lot of it was from our readers, our subscribers. But as we grew and became number one, obviously then advertisers had said, hey, this is the most powerful medium in the country. We also want to advertise in the medium. So now it's about 50-50, half subscription and half advertising. But they work in inverse. Whenever there's a political crisis, advertisers actually stay away and you get more subscribers. And when things are calm and cool and there's no political crisis, then you have advertising going up and subscription going down. So in a way, it helps cover each other, and I think it's a good blend of both models, subscription as well as advertising.
Because during these times, what's your economic model at the moment, or are you making still a profit?
Yes, we do make a profit. Because of COVID-19, we've seen a decrease in advertising revenue by 40%. All advertisers are holding back because of the economic crisis and down in retail. But we've seen a lift in subscription by about 20%, as more people are concerned about news, about the change of government. They want to know what's happening. So again, it works inversely. So whenever advertising goes down, we are able to push subscription up to compensate for the loss of revenue.
So you would, sounds like a healthy model, is it?
Yeah. So I think it is. I think that if you do serious journalism, then some form of subscription or membership or donation should be a key part of your business model. Donations can go up and down, and I think after a while people may not want to donate repeatedly. So we feel that the subscription model actually works best. We charge about $50 a year for a subscription, and we also sell subscriptions to universities, to other media outlets. So you can charge, to the parliament, to the different ministries. So we get a pretty wide reach.
And that's enough to pay your journalists and to pay your photographers. Is it?
Yes, we have made profits in most years in the last 10 years. Most years we are quite profitable.
Okay, Tamara, is this the solution?
Well, I find it really interesting, and particularly like 20 years already. I would be I'm very curious as to how it started and how quickly you grew, and whether indeed it's been remaining in balance. I think what you see is key everywhere is the mixed model, the mixed funding model. So indeed that you don't only rely on subscriptions, you don't only rely on donations, you don't only rely on subsidies or advertisement, but have a mixture. And it seems that in this case, there's a beautiful balance. At least it balances each other out. I have a question then in terms of who is able to pay the subscription fee, and do you see, is there a diverse readership? Who do you reach with it, and is that a concern that you have?
Well, definitely, there's a mixed model. For example, for the Malay language, we keep that free, but we charge for the English and Chinese language. We're able to make sure that we maximize our audience using different types of mixed models, not one or the other. Despite having a subscription, we're still the most widely read media in the country. If you look at Reuters digital news reports, Malaysia Kini reaches out to 24% of adult Malaysians, even higher than the biggest television station in the country. So
really impressive.
Yeah. So we are the only publication that publishes in 4 languages. So we reach out to the rural areas and people of different ethnic background and different language background. So that is how we have a maximum influence in the politics of the country.
Nighat, is there something similar in Pakistan?
We do have digital media platforms, but not really like the kind of journalism that Ramesh is talking about. I mean, I think we are catching up. But also the funding model is one thing that the trend that I'm seeing is that they mostly apply for, like funding. And now the tech giants are also chiming in, Google and, other social media platforms, which I'm not sure should be a concern for all of us. But they're like digital media platforms who are starting and who are very, very popular. Then the mainstream platforms, they are getting these fundings and they are producing news, and I think their audience is mostly the internet users, mostly millennials and young people. So I think audience also matter, the ones who don't want to watch TV anymore or who don't even know about the radio as such. So they are the ones who are, following digital media platforms in Pakistan.
Because Nighat, I mean, in your role at Facebook, your new role at Facebook. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of talk about fake news, which should be filtered on or should be tagged on Facebook and other social media platforms. Is that also a role which you will have to look into this?
Not really. I mean, maybe the misinformation sort of comes under. Will come under the cases that we will look into, but our role mainly is around, the cases that has already been decided by the Facebook, and there are aggrieved parties who want to appeal against those decisions, or the Facebook can reach out to the board and say that there is this situation where the platform is unable to decide, but at the same time it will impact the larger society. So we are I'm very excited in terms of looking forward to the cases which will basically impact the countries and the larger societies, especially when it comes to social media platforms.
Mm. Because Tamara, how are we going to deal with this? Because I mean, there's so much fake news going around. Where if we look at the U.S., it's the news channels are pretty much aligned with either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So if you're Republican, you look at Fox News, and if you're a Democrat, you look at CNN. How do we have to deal with this? I mean, that is this. You were talking about public, where it needs to be a government institution or a public good.
It's a really tricky question, because on the one hand, and I cannot speak, of course, for the whole world. I wouldn't dare. But on the one hand, there is valuable information out there in the public, and how can you make sure that people even want to read that, want to go there, can find their way to it? It's a really tricky question. So where is the responsibility? So on the one hand, individuals, each of us have our own responsibility in finding and checking information and trying to weigh opinions, trying to see where am I coming from, what's my assumption when I read this, why do I not believe it, why do I believe it? So that's our individual responsibility. But then the question is everyone equally facilitated to take on that role? Can everyone find their way to information that is out there that is helpful or meaningful or trustworthy? And I think what Nighat said is indeed there are so many groups of people that are actually don't even have access to the devices, let alone then have access to that information. So the problem is so complex, and there's no one easy answer to it. And I think indeed, okay, on the one hand, making sure that the information is there, but then also how do you help people navigate? How do you make sure that the information keeps being there, of quality? And luckily we had now an example of a model that worked, but there are so many models that haven't worked on the long run. So there's a lot of work to do.
Can I also chime in here? I think the way I see this problem around disinformation and misinformation, it's not now just limited to the internet and platforms. When you have a media which is which doesn't have really stronger editorial controls and skills, and half of their news is dependent on what people are producing online, when they pick up that news and when they don't have skills to verify or fact check, and then they run those tickers and news on the mainstream media channels, so the people even who don't have access to the internet, they have just that information coming from TV or radio, and they are consuming that information. They don't even know whether it's a fake news or whether it's a misinformation, or they cannot even differentiate between misinformation and disinformation. And I see a problem here where we cannot hold big media houses accountables, the TV channels who have millions of subscribers, and on the people in the rural areas who don't have access to internet, they have access to the TV channels and radio. So when they will consume that news that is based on misinformation and disinformation, that's where I see the problem becomes larger than the social media platforms and online spaces. I think another thing is also WhatsApp, for instance, the misinformation that is spread through WhatsApp. WhatsApp is something that is very, very popular even in the rural areas. So and through the people who do not even have like a proper access to internet, at least they get that much internet where they have access to WhatsApp. So WhatsApp has become this hotbed of misinformation, and I don't know like how the organizations can play their part, but we are very small entities, and I think governments really need to look into this in terms of not only awareness but also like holding these tech giants accountable, that what they are doing about misinformation and disinformation happening on their platform, because it's actually impacting the entirety of the news, not just on the platforms but on the mainstream media as well.
I'm afraid we have to leave it here. I mean, I think we could continue this conversation, this very necessary conversation, much longer, which I'm sure we will pay attention to in the near future. Sorry to leave it here, but I do want to thank my guests for their time and their willingness to be here. Tamara, first of all, here in the studio in Amsterdam, and then Pramesh in Malaysia and Nighat in Pakistan. Good night to you all. I think that's almost sure for you, Pramesh. And would be very happy to see you next week for another edition of Emerging Stories. We will have one of my guests will be Ingeborg Beugel, who is a correspondent in Greece for the Groene Amsterdammer, among some of the other newspapers and magazines. And we will talk about some of the migration issues and the asylum kids, which are still stuck in Greece, and where there's an unwillingness from Europe to admit them to the different countries. Thanks a lot for now, and wish you a good day or a good night, and see you next week.